This week's topic is 20th century classical music. We will be introducing lots of different styles, forms, and ideas of what music is during this week. Take a listen to all the different listening examples throughout the lectures, and I hope that you'll find some of them very interesting. I hope you'll actually dislike some of them, and I hope you'll love some of them. The music from this period is varied, it's emotional, and at its base asks the question of what music truly is and what it is that we listen to every day in our lives. The music and the art of the 20th century, as I've said, is varied. One of the examples of artwork you can see here. What do you see in this piece of art? Do you simply see shapes and colors, vivid imagery, or can you see the face of a man, the doorway to his mind, and the dreams that he might be dreaming? Art is subjective. We learned this in the Romantic period, and that trend only continues into the 20th century in the form of art and music. Another example of 20th century art is below. This is supposed to be an image of the crucifixion of Christ, very different from the ones that you saw during the Baroque or the Classical period. Can you actually see the different aspects of this story? Why did Picasso choose in this particular picture to use color or white? Why did he choose to create images where the heads of the figures are skewed, where the legs are facing the wrong directions, where perspective is completely off? Many of these aspects that you see here in this piece of art are questions that musicians and composers asked as well. How does perspective change? How does emotion affect music? What is music? What is art? From a historical point of view, many things happen in the 20th century that really affect art and music and how they develop. Remember that in this past century there have been 2 world wars and other wars besides, ones that have had a huge impact on humanity, that have tortured some people, and in which some countries have triumphed over others. Wars in which morality has been questioned. You also have the solidification of countries and their actual borders across the world. Eastern Europe is still up in question at certain points, but for the most part, every continent has now been created into separate countries, and those countries are firm and established and have their own ideas of a national perspective and political power. Political superpowers have also emerged during the past century, which has affected how art and music have survived across the world. Another trend that has happened over the last 100 years is that the equality between races and between men and women have been challenged and accepted. Now we see all races as equal and all men and women as being on equal footing. Of course, we still strive and struggle in society to prove this equality sometimes, but we do believe now that all humans have a right to be human and to be considered equal beings. Before this century, that was not always the case, and it is still, like I said, a struggle in some parts of the world to find this equality as a part of society. This century has proven that we are able to question what it is to be human and to be moral, and to do something about it. This has been a century of action rather than passivism. Rules have been broken repeatedly throughout this century in art forms, musical forms, political perspectives, in every way possible, especially in the idea of democracy and its power. Democracy gives us the right to break the rules, because it believes in the fact that every human being has a right to speak its own mind and to have that opinion valued. You also see the rise of academia. The college as an institution grew hugely during this last 100 years until today. The college and university have become one of the most powerful institutions across the world, and it is part of the culture that helps the composer to actually survive. Most composers today work at universities or at colleges, and their careers are protected by those colleges and universities. It's interesting to watch how music has changed over the 20th century, especially from a historical perspective or from the perspective of art as a general genre. But there are some things that are definitely easy to recognize. The first being that classical music used to be popular music, but at the beginning of the 20th century, as romantic music was ebbing, popular music broke from classical music and became separate styles and genres. Classical traditions then became more and more diverse, but composers weren't really interested in what an audience wanted. They weren't interested in being popular. They wanted to break rules, create new forms and styles. They wanted to revolt. They wanted to have revolution and decide what music truly was. They believed that listeners were going to be very open-minded during this era because politically, socially, economically, and morally, people were questioning everything about themselves and about the structures of their lives. You have to be open-minded in order to grow, and composers, performers, and listeners were all striving to be open-minded so that they could hear and invent new things when it came to art and music. In the classical and romantic eras, you've learned that there were expectations. In the 20th century, there were no such things. All bets were off. Composers were allowed absolute freedom from every element and from every idea of what music was. Composers really struggled for the past 100 years to define music. What did it mean personally to create music? What did it mean to listen to it? What was music at its most fundamental level? And every composer answered this question in different ways. The music you're going to hear this week is all phenomenal music, some of which you're going to love and some of which you're going to hate, because the composers who were writing this music were answering the question in a very personal manner. And so as an audience or a listener, it's our right to listen to this music and like it or hate it, however much we choose to. As long as we choose also to understand it and think about why it is that this music was written, then we have the right to either listen to it or not. This week, we're going to explore some of the most popularized classical forms and styles that were created between 1900 and 1945. This is the brunt of the lectures and the reading for the week, because it was between 1900 and 1945 that most of the more interesting and acceptable, or not acceptable, depending on how you define it, music from the 20th century was created. We will also explore some of the styles invented after 1945, but not all of them. Some of them we will simply define so that you know they exist, and others we will both define, talk about who composes them, and then also listen to an example of them. The music for this week is all about experimentation. It's about stretching our ideas of what music is and how sounds of all kinds can be used to create music. Enjoy learning about the composers who write this music, the style of music they've created, and then listening to the examples of music. Have fun.